Part 1, Dramatic Hook, 250 words. At dawn on July 12, 1943, German tank crews belonging to the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandard Adolf Hitler waited along the fields near Prokhorovka, convinced of their superiority. The Panther Os. D, with its 75mm KWK-42L/70 gun and frontal armor up to 80mm thick, had just entered service. The Tiger I, weighing 54 tons and mounting the formidable 88mm KWK-36 gun, led the spearhead. Facing 300 German tanks in this sector, crewmen openly dismissed the Soviet T-34/76, calling it crude and primitive. Within 72 hours, these same crews confronted a reversal that left 1,000 Soviet T-34s and KV-1s surging across a 6-mile front. In the span of 3 days, the Red Army's 5th Guards Tank Army, under the command of Lieutenant General Pavel Rotmistrov, hurled over 850 T-34/76 and nearly 200 KV-1 heavy tanks against the German lines. The battlefield at Prokhorovka became the site of the largest armored clash in history, with more than 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns committed on both sides between July 12 and 15. German radio intercepts recorded frantic calls for reinforcements as Panther and Tiger crews were overwhelmed by wave after wave of advancing Soviet armor. In just 72 hours, the German 2 SS Panzer Corps lost over 350 tanks and assault guns, suffering catastrophic losses. The technical edge of German engineering was buried beneath the relentless pressure of Soviet mass production, a factor that few in the German command had truly anticipated. Part 2, Historical Setup, 350 words. At exactly 0430 hours on July 12, 1943, the first Soviet artillery barrage erupted east of Prokhorovka, a small rail junction 55 kilometers southeast of Kursk. The battlefield stretched across open wheat fields, bordered by the Sel River to the north and dense forests to the south. Lieutenant General Pavel Rotmistrov, commanding the 5th Guards Tank Army, coordinated his attack with Marshal Georgy Zhukov, Deputy Supreme Commander of the Red Army. Opposing them, SS Obergruppenführer Paul Hauser oversaw the German 2 SS Panzer Corps, including the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandard Adolf Hitler, the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, and the 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf. By 0500 hours, more than 850 T-34/76 medium tanks, each armed with a 76.2mm F-34 gun and protected by 45mm of sloped frontal armor, advanced behind a rolling barrage. Supporting them were nearly 200 KV-1 heavy tanks, weighing 45 tons and equipped with 90mm armor and a 76mm ZIS-5 gun. Facing them, the Germans deployed approximately 300 tanks in this sector, including 90 new Panther Os. D tanks, 15 Tiger I heavy tanks, and over 100 Panzer IVs, most fitted with the long-barreled 75mm KWK-40L/48 cannon. German crews had previously disparaged the T-34's crude optics, noisy transmission, and manual turret traverse. However, the T-34's wide 500mm tracks allowed it to maneuver rapidly across the muddy terrain, where the heavier German Panthers suffered frequent breakdowns. Over 40 Panthers were out of action by midday July 12 due to mechanical failure or mines. The Soviets, producing up to 1,200 T-34s per month at plants like Factory No. 183 in Nizhny Tagil, could replace losses at a rate the Germans could not match. By 0700 hours, the first Soviet tanks crashed into the German lines at point-blank range, initiating brutal close-quarters combat. The technical sophistication of the German tanks was countered by the sheer volume of Soviet armor and the tactical coordination of Soviet tank brigades, which exploited gaps in the German defensive line. The proximity of fighting reduced the effectiveness of the German superior long-range guns, forcing them into a deadly melee they had not anticipated. Part 3, Rising Tension, 300 words. At 0800 hours, Soviet tank battalions of the 29th Tank Corps surged through the morning haze, reaching the first line of German anti-tank defenses. From the German perspective, Obersturmführer Karl Braumann of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich reported at 0815 hours that Soviet T-34s were closing to within 100 meters before firing. By 0900 hours, the 5th Guards Tank Army's 18th and 29th Tank Corps had committed over 400 tanks to the assault, while Rotmistrov received an urgent radio communication from Marshal Zhukov instructing him to maintain relentless pressure. At Allied command, Rotmistrov acknowledged the staggering losses, over 50 Soviet tanks destroyed within the first hour, but ordered reserves from the 170th Tank Brigade forward at 0930 hours. Soviet tank crews, led by Captain Alexander Oskin, reported disabling 2 Tiger I tanks at 0945 hours by closing to less than 50 meters and firing at the turret ring. Meanwhile, behind the German lines, SS Obergruppenführer Hauser's staff recorded at 1000 hours that their Panther battalion had only 12 operational vehicles left out of an original 90, most disabled by mines or mechanical failures rather than enemy fire. On the ground, the 181st Tank Brigade's T-34s bypassed burning hulks to flank German positions by 10:30 hours, while German Commander Hauser radioed Army Group South headquarters for permission to withdraw. The sheer volume of Soviet armor, coordinated artillery, and close air support from Il-2 Sturmovik aircraft left German tankers fighting for survival rather than victory. By noon, both sides were locked in chaotic, close-range combat, with the outcome shifting by the minute as more Soviet tanks poured into the breach. In the hours following the midday chaos at Prokhorovka, the battlefield became a graveyard of smoldering tanks and shattered hopes. By the evening of July 12, the roar of engines faded into an uneasy silence, punctuated only by the distant thud of artillery and the crackle of burning wrecks. Red Army medics, under the command of Colonel Sofia Petrovna, moved cautiously among the ruined machines, pulling wounded tankers from the twisted metal while snipers and artillery fire kept everyone on edge. Reports from the Soviet 9th Guards Airborne Division, which had moved in to secure the flanks, described fields so littered with destroyed armor that movement by foot was almost impossible. On the German side, Hauptmann Ernst Barkmann of the 2nd SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment penned a terse letter to his wife, describing the iron storm that had swept over their positions. Barkmann's report, intercepted by Soviet intelligence, lamented the loss of seasoned crews and the growing shortage of operational panzers. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe's attempts to reclaim air superiority faltered as Soviet Yak-9 fighters harassed supply columns and forward positions, further isolating the defenders. By July 13, Soviet reconnaissance units under Major Yuri Belov pushed west, probing for weak points in the surviving German lines. They relayed critical information to General Pavel Rotmistrov, whose staff now faced the daunting task of consolidating gains amidst heavy casualties. Soviet engineers, led by Lieutenant Nikolai Tarasov, worked through the night to clear paths through minefields for the next wave of tanks. Their efforts were hampered by intermittent German artillery barrages and the threat of counterattacks, which materialized sporadically as Kampfgruppe formations attempted to reclaim lost ground. On the strategic level, Stavka, the Soviet High Command, received intelligence from partisan groups operating deep behind German lines. Reports indicated that the Germans were hastily regrouping south of Prokhorovka, forming new defensive positions along the Sel River. Marshal Zhukov, reviewing these findings, ordered a halt to piecemeal attacks and called for a coordinated strike along the entire front, aiming to exploit the disarray in the German command structure. By the end of July 13, both sides had suffered grievous losses, but the Red Army's momentum was undeniable, and the Wehrmacht's defense was showing signs of irreversible strain. The days that followed revealed the true cost of the confrontation. Soviet burial details counted hundreds of tanks lost, both burned out and abandoned, while German recovery teams struggled to salvage damaged Panthers and Tigers under the watchful eyes of Red Army snipers. The once pristine wheat fields of Kursk had become a haunting testament to the ferocity of modern armored warfare. The fighting at Prokhorovka exposed fundamental truths about the evolving nature of armored combat. For the first time, the myth of German invincibility was shattered not by superior Soviet weaponry, but by relentless mass and tactical adaptation. Soviet commanders, analyzing after-action reports, recognized that their willingness to engage at close quarters had neutralized the technical superiority of the Tiger and Panther tanks. The T-34's mobility, combined with aggressive maneuvering, allowed Soviet crews to close the distance, where the heavier German armor's long-range guns were less effective. Technical assessments from the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army revealed that over 60% of losses were attributable not to direct hits from German tank guns, but to mines, artillery, and air attacks. This revelation led to a re-evaluation of tank deployment doctrine. Engineers noted that many tanks immobilized by mines were later destroyed by German anti-tank teams or artillery while crews attempted repairs. Comparisons were drawn with previous battles at Kharkov and Rzhev, where static engagements had favored the defenders. At Prokhorovka, however, the Soviets' willingness to press forward, even at high cost, overwhelmed the German defensive calculus. On the German side, captured field orders analyzed by Soviet intelligence revealed a growing sense of desperation. The rapid attrition of armored strength, coupled with the mechanical unreliability of the new Panther tanks, forced German commanders to reconsider their reliance on heavy armor breakthroughs. Wehrmacht analysts, in post-battle debriefings, noted that the lack of infantry support and overextended supply lines left their panzers vulnerable to encirclement and close-quarters assault. The lessons learned at Prokhorovka echoed those of Stalingrad. Technical superiority could not compensate for strategic overreach and logistical shortcomings. Military historians have since debated the true significance of the Prokhorovka clash. Some argue that it marked the beginning of the end for the German armored spearhead on the Eastern Front. Others point to the staggering Soviet losses as evidence of the Red Army's willingness to trade lives for territory. What remains clear is that the battle catalyzed a transformation in Soviet operational thinking, emphasizing coordinated attacks, flexible reserves, and the integration of air and ground assets. The evidence, drawn from recovered documents, battlefield surveys, and post-war interviews, underscores the complex interplay between technology, doctrine, and sheer human will that defined the outcome. In the wake of the bloodletting at Prokhorovka, both Soviet and German high commands were forced to recalibrate their strategies. General Model, newly appointed to oversee the German defensive effort in the southern sector, issued immediate orders to withdraw shattered armored formations behind the Sel River and construct fortified fallback positions. His directives emphasized the conservation of remaining tanks and the integration of anti-tank artillery in depth, hoping to blunt further Soviet advances. Within the Soviet command, General Rotmistrov convened an emergency council with his brigade commanders. Drawing upon the hard-won lessons of the previous days, he issued new orders. Reconnaissance was to be intensified, tank units must avoid frontal assaults against prepared positions, and coordination with ground attack aircraft was to be prioritized. Soviet artillery regiments, now rearmed and resupplied, began a systematic bombardment of suspected German strongpoints, softening enemy lines ahead of renewed offensives. Morale across the Red Army was a mixture of exhaustion and grim determination. Political commissars worked tirelessly to bolster the spirits of frontline troops, citing the heavy German losses as proof of impending victory. For the Wehrmacht, however, the mood was somber. Letters intercepted by Soviet censors revealed mounting disillusionment among German soldiers, many of whom now doubted the feasibility of victory on the Eastern Front. As the operational tempo shifted, Stavka ordered the concentration of fresh mechanized corps in the Kursk salient, setting the stage for a broader counteroffensive. Preparations began for Operation Kutuzov, aimed at exploiting the weakened German southern flank. Meanwhile, Soviet propaganda units broadcast news of the Red Army's achievements to occupied territories, signaling a turning tide in the war. The Battle of Prokhorovka, though costly, had irreversibly altered the balance of power on the Eastern Front. With German armor in retreat and Soviet forces poised for a new surge, the next phase of the campaign promised even greater upheaval, a relentless push westward that would carry the Red Army to the gates of Berlin itself. Part 1: Lesser-known details. The aftermath of Prokhorovka rippled across the steppe in ways rarely acknowledged in official dispatches. In the battered remnants of the 18th Tank Corps, Sergeant Yakov Mykolov scrawled by candlelight in a torn notebook, "We are told the enemy runs, but our fuel trucks do not come. We push the tanks ourselves at night, praying the Germans do not hear the engines go silent." His diary, recovered decades later from a family attic in Voronezh, details the daily struggle for basic supplies. Soviet advances, grand in scope, often paused for want of gasoline and spare parts. The mud of late summer, churned by thousands of tracks and boots, transformed roads into treacherous quagmires. Even horse-drawn supply columns, pressed into service as mechanized transport failed, found progress nearly impossible. German records, equally candid in their internal communications, reveal a dissonance between the image of an orderly withdrawal and the chaos on the ground. A decrypted message from a Panzer Grenadier company describes an uninterrupted retreat, with wounded left behind for lack of ambulances and supply trucks abandoned when fuel dumps were destroyed by Soviet artillery. Feldwebel Hans Klein noted in his private journal, "We salvage what we can." At night, the fields glow with burning vehicles, our own, destroyed to keep them from Ivan. Official Red Army reports credited the successful resupply of frontline units to heroic efforts by transport battalions. Yet, recently declassified Stavka memos paint a different picture. Only half the promised ammunition reached forward positions in the first week after the battle, and entire tank brigades went into action with less than a full load of shells. Improvised repairs were the order of the day, cannibalizing knocked-out vehicles for parts, jury-rigging tracks with fence wire, and siphoning fuel from civilian farms. Environmental factors compounded every setback. The oppressive July heat, followed by sudden thunderstorms, ruined field hospitals and turned makeshift airstrips into morasses. Pilots of the 2nd Air Army, grounded for days by fog and rain, wrote frustrated letters to family. Our birds are ready, but the earth will not let us fly. These are the unseen currents that shaped the tempo of Operation Kutuzov and the fate of thousands. Part 2, Historian Perspectives. For decades, the narrative of the post-Prokhorovka campaign was shaped by Soviet and Western historians working from incomplete data and state-sanctioned sources. Early Cold War scholarship, typified by John Erickson's seminal works, lauded the Red Army's operational brilliance while glossing over the logistical fragility and the improvisational chaos that dogged both sides. The opening of Russian archives in the 1990s, however, revolutionized the field. Declassified Stavka correspondence and battlefield reports exposed frequent mismatches between reported and actual tank strengths, undermining the myth of overwhelming Soviet numerical superiority in every engagement. Contemporary historians such as David Glantz, drawing on both German war diaries and Soviet after-action reviews, highlight the razor-thin margins by which Soviet offensives succeeded. Glantz's analysis of the 5th Guards Mechanized Corps, for example, reveals that its famed deep thrusts were at times little more than battalion-sized probes, magnified by propaganda into sweeping breakthroughs. The discovery of German prisoner interrogations, kept classified by Soviet authorities for decades, further complicated the picture, revealing the extent of Wehrmacht disintegration and the psychological toll exacted by Soviet artillery barrages. Academic debate now centers on the sustainability of the Soviet war machine. Was the Red Army's momentum in the late summer of 1943 the result of inexorable industrial might, or a fragile, high-risk gamble that could have faltered with a few more logistical setbacks? Recent scholarship, informed by the meticulous work of Russian archivists, suggests a middle ground. Soviet operational art was flexible and adaptive, but extraordinarily costly in men and material. The myth of effortless Soviet advance has yielded to a narrative of hard-fought, resource-constrained progress, punctuated by moments of brilliance and catastrophe in equal measure. Part 3, Human Stories. Amid these grand maneuvers and shifting historiographical tides, the personal stories of ordinary soldiers illuminate the true cost of the campaign. Nikolai Petrovich Ivanov, a sapper born in the village of Zalagosh, was conscripted in 1942 and served with the 6th Guards Army during Operation Kutuzov. In a letter to his mother, preserved in the Oryol Regional Archives, he wrote, "I have seen the earth torn open by shells, and men buried within seconds. My hands shake when I sleep, but still we build the bridges, one more river, one more night." Ivanov survived the war, though the trauma of constant shellfire left him hearing impaired and plagued by nightmares. He became a schoolteacher, using his experiences to teach generations about the cost of peace. On the German side, Franz Josef Mahler, a radio operator with the 7th Panzer Division, chronicled his ordeal in a series of compact, coded messages to his fiancée in Dusseldorf. "I hear the Russian guns before I see their tanks. We move at dusk, always afraid of the partisans." Captured near Kromy after a failed breakout attempt, Mahler spent 3 years in a Soviet labor camp. He returned home in 1948, emaciated but alive, and later contributed his testimony to a collection of POW memoirs that challenged post-war narratives of German invincibility. Finally, Lena Baranova, a nurse with the 370th Rifle Division, offers a rare perspective as a frontline medic. In her unpublished memoir, she recounts working for 72 hours without sleep to treat both Soviet and German wounded. "Blood knows no uniform," she wrote. "I held the hands of dying boys who called for their mothers in Russian, in German, sometimes in Polish. We saved who we could, sometimes an enemy, sometimes a friend." After the war, Baranova became one of the Soviet Union's first female trauma surgeons, her wartime experience fueling a lifelong commitment to medicine. Through their words and lives, the vast machinery of war is rendered personal, its impact measured not only in kilometers gained or divisions destroyed, but in memories carried, wounds endured, and futures irrevocably altered. Part 1: Strategic Consequences. In the days following the campaign's end, the Red Army's High Command issued immediate directives based on hard-won lessons. Ammunition reserves were redistributed to depleted frontline units, while mobile repair brigades received urgent reinforcement orders to salvage and return damaged armor to service. The Wehrmacht, reeling from the cumulative shocks, hastily shifted panzer reserves southward in a bid to stabilize collapsing fronts, leaving critical sectors undermanned and vulnerable. Within weeks, these adjustments triggered a cascade of operational changes. Soviet engineers were tasked with constructing temporary bridges at record speed, enabling new thrusts into German-held territory. Railway workshops in Bryansk and Kursk operated around the clock, expediting the repair of rolling stock to sustain supply lines. German intelligence, recognizing its overestimation of Soviet losses, revised its strategic assessments and adopted a more defensive posture, prioritizing the fortification of urban centers over risky counteroffensives. By the autumn, the momentum generated by these changes began to reshape the Eastern Front. The Soviet advance, though costly, forced the Wehrmacht into a continuous retreat, compressing German lines and overstretching already exhausted divisions. Soviet partisans, now operating with greater logistical support, disrupted German withdrawal routes, further accelerating the collapse of enemy positions. The Red Army's ability to adapt tactics and logistics under extreme pressure became a blueprint for subsequent operations through Belarus and into the Baltic states. Over the following years, the consequences of these campaigns rippled across the entirety of the Second World War. The destruction of key German formations in the east denied Hitler the reserves needed to stem Allied advances in the west. Soviet industry, having demonstrated its capacity to sustain high-intensity operations, shifted focus to rebuilding liberated territories and supporting the final drive towards Berlin. The campaign's lessons on coordination, deception, and operational depth were integrated into post-war military doctrines on both sides of the Iron Curtain, influencing generations of strategists and planners. The cumulative effect was unmistakable. The balance of initiative on the Eastern Front had shifted decisively, hastening the downfall of the Third Reich and redrawing the strategic map of Europe for decades to come. Part 2: Turning Point Analysis. Had the campaign faltered, had Soviet logistical improvisation failed or German counterattacks succeeded, the course of the war in the East might have unfolded very differently. A prolonged German defense could have stabilized the front, freeing up divisions for deployment against the Western Allies and potentially delaying the Soviet march to Berlin by months, if not years. The prospect of a negotiated peace, while unlikely, would have gained traction among emboldened German commanders and a war-weary civilian population. In comparison to other pivotal engagements such as the encirclement battles at Stalingrad or the later Vistula-Oder offensive, this campaign stands out not for its scale alone, but for the razor-thin margins and the sheer improvisation that defined both victory and defeat. Unlike the set-piece battles of earlier years, the outcome here was shaped as much by logistical ingenuity and psychological endurance as by firepower or numbers. The ability to adapt under duress, to extract opportunity from adversity, set a precedent that redefined both Soviet and German operational art. Historians now broadly agree that this campaign marked a decisive inflection point. Early Soviet triumphalism, which depicted the advance as inexorable, has been tempered by archival revelations of near-catastrophic setbacks. German military memoirs, long colored by narratives of betrayal and collapse, have been supplemented by contemporary research exposing the cumulative effects of attrition and resource starvation. The scholarly consensus recognizes this period as a watershed where initiative irreversibly passed to the Red Army, and the German capacity for strategic recovery was fatally undermined. Modern analysis has further refined our understanding, emphasizing the campaign's role in shaping the post-war world. It demonstrated that wars of attrition, while costly, could yield strategic breakthroughs when paired with adaptability and relentless logistical effort. The lessons learned reverberate still in military academies, in the doctrines of rapid exploitation, and in the enduring study of operational art. Part 3: Legacy and Memorial. In the years that followed, the lives of those swept up in the campaign diverged in unexpected ways. Ivanov, the sapper who survived the crucible of war, became a fixture in his village, quietly mentoring new generations as a teacher and community leader. His personal archived letters, medals, and a battered shovel was eventually donated to a regional museum, where it remains a focal point for student field trips and Victory Day commemorations. Franz Josef Mahler, after his return to Germany, contributed to reconciliation efforts between former adversaries, speaking at remembrance events and co-authoring a memoir with a former Soviet guard. Lena Baranova, whose wartime service redefined her life, established a pioneering trauma clinic in Moscow, training nurses and doctors whose expertise would later save countless lives during the Cold War's crises. Across the former front lines, the landscape bears silent witness. In Oryol and Bryansk, memorial complexes rise amid placid fields, granite slabs etched with names, eternal flames, and preserved trenches mark the passage of armies and the endurance of civilians. Museums in both Russia and Germany host rotating exhibits of personal artifacts, battle maps, and oral histories, ensuring that the complexity and cost of the campaign are not lost to time. Annual commemorations draw aging veterans and their descendants, their presence a living bridge between past and present. For military professionals, the campaign is an enduring case study in the challenges of sustaining offensive momentum under severe constraints. Its lessons are dissected in staff colleges from Moscow to West Point, informing doctrines on logistics, adaptation, and the human dimension of war. The enduring value of these lessons is measured not only in historical analysis, but in the evolving strategies of modern conflict. Today, more than 8 decades later, the campaign's legacy is etched into the collective memory of nations and the fabric of military thought. Its true measure lies not in the ground gained or lost, but in the millions of lives it shaped and the enduring reality that, from those crucibles of suffering and resilience, the post-war world was forged.